Good day, my dear friends. Today we will be discussing about oxygenation, ways to improve oxygenation during ventilation, and what are the ways to improve the mean airway pressure during ventilation. We are having this online module as a part of neonatal ventilation, as a part of Neocon conference. And following this talk, if you wish to ask any further questions, please feel free to comment on the group or the online comment box. So, to begin with, we will have our objectives for the day. The objective for the day is one, to understand the process of oxygenation and how oxygen is transported from lungs to the tissue. Second, we will also learn a few words about oxygen indices and what are the various oxygen indices which will be useful as you're measuring the prognosis or measuring the oxygenation content in a baby who's already ventilated. And third, we will rush through a few slides focusing on mean airway pressure and what are the ways to improve mean airway pressure. Now let's look at the steps in oxygen transport. Before we go into steps in oxygen transport, let us define respiration. Simple respiration is the process of delivering oxygen to the cell, and it carries away the byproduct of it, which is called carbon dioxide. So this process of respiration involves gas exchange in the lung, circulation of gases through the bloodstream, and transfer of gases at the cellular level. In the first step of oxygenation is ventilation. So we will be talking more about ventilation in this slide. So how does gases exchange from one area to other? The movement of gas from one area to other is from higher concentration pressure to a lower gas pressure. That is, the airways up to the bronchus take part in conduction of gases, but they don't take part in gas exchange. So this part of the airway constitutes anatomical dead space, but they don't involve in the gas exchange because the gas exchange happens only in the alveoli. Now, if you look at the pressure, the total atmospheric pressure is 760 and the water vapor pressure is about 47 in the trachea. So if taking these two into account, the pressure, the PO2, at the level of trachea is around 150. There's an equation where you minus 760, which is the atmospheric pressure, minus the water vapor pressure, which is 47, into the concentration of oxygen, which is 14%, divided by 100. So you get 150. So this is the pressure in the trachea. Now, by the time the oxygen has reached the alveoli, the PO2 has fallen further down. Now it reaches around 100. And why is it fallen down? Because two reasons. One is the removal of oxygen by the pulmonary capillaries and its continual supply by alveolar ventilation. Now, how does it imply in clinical practice? Ventilation can be affected by either a restrictive or an obstructive lung disease, or a combination of both. In a restricted lung disease, it has inability to expand the lungs. Obstructive lung disease has inability to move all the gas in and out of the lung. And also not to forget the fact that ventilation can be affected by other region, can be central, it can be a nerve, it can be muscle, it can be neuromuscular, etc. And likewise, oxygen gas exchange, what you can see in the right side, the pressure at the alveoli is around 100 millimeter of mercury. However, the moment it reaches the capillaries, the pressure falls down to 40 millimeters of mercury. And what you see here is the alveolar capillary membrane. The thickness of alveolar capillary membrane is around 0.5 microns. So this oxygen diffuses through the membrane from a higher pressure, which is 100, to a lower pressure, which is 40. And after the oxygen moves into the pulmonary vein, it goes to left side of the heart, we come to the systemic circulation. Now let us look at how the gases are exchanged. Gases are exchanged by two processes. The main process which is involved is alveolar ventilation. The second process is by perfusion or alveolar perfusion. And there is a process of diffusion in between also, which is called the partial pressure gradient. Now what is alveolar oxygenation? It is denoted by PaO2. The A, which is in capital letter, means it is alveolar. The A, which is a small letter, it means it is in the arterial. So PaO2 has a formula which is actually involves the atmospheric pressure, it involves the FiO2, it involves ventilation, and also the amount of carbon dioxide in the alveoli. Hence, when you write a formula, it becomes atmospheric pressure minus the water vapor pressure into the amount of FiO2 minus PCO2, or the amount of carbon dioxide in alveoli. This is divided by R, which is a constant, which is around 0.8 to 1. The second is the ventilation and perfusion. Now let us understand the concept of a perfect lung. In a perfect lung, all the alveoli will share equal amount of ventilation, and pulmonary capillaries that surround it will be equally distributed, which means the cardiac output per alveoli is almost similar to all the cardiac output over there, which takes place only 2% bypassed without the alveoli passing through it. However, this is not the case when you are looking at a diseased lung or a pathological lung, where the alveolar dead space refers to the volume of gas which they have more of wasted ventilation, which means that there's more of alveolar dead space where the perfusion is inadequate, and these are called as wasted ventilation. And this is more seen in clinical practices when you look at two different kind of pathology. We'll come to that. Now let's look at the normal pathology. In a normal lung. In a normal lung, what you see here is a PaO2 in the alveoli. It is around 100, that's what you see. And the amount of carbon dioxide is around 40. This is the norm what you see here. However, in the pulmonary capillaries, the PO2 is around 40 and CO2 is a little higher than that, which is around 46. Now let's look at the disease process of it. What you see here in the first is partially obstructed, especially you see it in RDS. So there will be a poorly ventilated alveolus, so which is represent low VQ ratio. V is for ventilator and Q is for perfusion. Here what you see here is that because of the partially blocked airway, it causes an underventilated lung, which means the PaO2 will decrease and the CO2 will rise up again. And on the right side, what you see is a different pathology where the alveoli is normal, but what here happened here, the blood flow is restricted over here. Now, when you have a restricted blood flow, most of these gases in the alveoli are not ventilated properly, which causes a physiological dead space in that area. Here, there's a high VQ mismatch, wherein the PaO2 in the alveoli increases and the PaCO2 is less in this scenario. Now let's look at a couple of clinical manifestation or clinical implications of this. One, because there is a ventilation perfusion mismatch, and these difference in partial pressure of oxygen between the alveoli and the arterial level correlates well with the VQ mismatch. And second, what happens is, what you've seen here in terms of obstructive or restrictive lung disorders, there will be high chance of hypercarbia. The way out is to oxygenate more or increase the pressure so that you open up the alveoli here. And almost similar to that pathology is when you have a problem with the interface in which the alveoli and the capillary membrane is affected either by excessive fluid in the alveoli or mucus or air trapping in the alveoli, and for those reasons or can be fibrosis also, and the same type of hypoxia can set in here. Now, having learned a few basics about VQ mismatch, let us go directly into the oxygen indices. First and foremost, most important, which we need to learn is oxygenation index or OI. So what is oxygenation index? So oxygenation index is actually a factor. That is, it is a cost, it's a pressure cost to achieve a certain amount of oxygenation in the form of increase in MAP. In the sense like, if you need to achieve 100% saturation or even more than 95% saturation, even if you're giving 100% FiO2 and high pressures, that means the oxygenation index is very high because it is giving a 95% saturation despite giving high pressures. So oxygenation index is a formula to be calculated, that is MAP, that is known here as PaW, which is also known as MAP, into FiO2, this multiplied by 100, the whole into PaO2. So if the value is more than 50, it signifies severe respiratory compromise. More than 40, it means it is an indication for ECMO. More than 25, especially in a child with pulmonary hypertension, is an indication for nitric oxide. The second indices which we need to be familiarized with is AaDO2 or AaO2. AaO2 is simply the gradient or the difference, we call it AaDO2, difference between the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli and the partial pressure of oxygen in the capillaries, the pulmonary capillary. In a healthy infant, the AaDO2 is less than 20 in room air. However, if the value is around 100 to 200, it means it is a moderate disease. More than 200 is severe disease. More than 400 to 600 means there is a high chances of mortality, and ECMO is indicated in this scenario. The next one is the ratio, or we call it the arterial alveolar tension. It's called as PaO2 A by A ratio. Normally, the amount of oxygen in the alveoli diffuses into the pulmonary capillary till almost all the hemoglobins are saturated there, wherein the normal value between these ratios should be 1. If, as we said in the previous scenario, where there is a pathology in the alveoli, like there is either edema or there is fibrosis in the alveoli, there will be severe compromise of gas exchange. Here we can expect a value less than 1. For example, 0.3 indicates severe compromise. These indices are very important when you are evaluating a child on a ventilator, giving importance to the amount of oxygen, amount of pressures, and the and the rate of ventilation that we are giving. Now, coming to the next part of the topic is oxygen transport. So, oxygen diffuses from an alveolar capillary membrane to the blood in the surrounding capillary till the PO2 in the capillary is equal to that of the alveoli. So, this process is normally completed by the time the blood has passed about 1/3 the way along the capillary, pulmonary capillary. Now, this oxygen is in the blood in two forms. One, it can be in the dissolved oxygen, which is known as the PaO2. Second, it can be in the combined form with hemoglobin, which is called the SaO2. Now, what is PaO2? So, PaO2 is a dissolved in the plasma. The amount of dissolved oxygen in the plasma is very less, is only less than 2%, and about 98% is combined with hemoglobin. And the amount of dissolved oxygen in the plasma is so minimal, that means it amounts to around 0.0003 ml in 100 ml of blood. So this is reflected as the partial pressure of oxygen which we take in blood gases in our daily practice. So this is the driving pressure of the oxygen molecule which enters the red blood cells, and it helps to chemically bind onto the hemoglobin. But this PaO2 cannot tell us how much of oxygen is there in the blood free, because it does not take into consideration the amount of combined oxygen with the hemoglobin. Now let's look at the combined oxygen with hemoglobin. That takes place for about 98%, which is a predominant form of oxygen, is 98%. Now each hemoglobin molecule has iron elements, and these iron elements binds to oxygen molecule. So there are 4 oxygen molecules which can bind to each iron atom. And when these 4 molecules are bind to hemoglobin, it is 100% saturated. Till then it will be very tightly packed, and then it will be loosely packed. The more saturated it is, the more affinity to oxygen it gives, so that more and more of iron or hemoglobin starts binding very rapidly. This will be very evident in the oxygen dissociation curve, which we'll be talking about in the next 2 slides. Now this oxygen binding occurs in a very fast response to a higher partial pressure of oxygen in the lung. Now when hemoglobin binds with oxygen, it is called as oxyhemoglobin. When one oxygen binds to hemoglobin, the other molecule also readily binds with the hemoglobin, and this binding is what we call as a cooperate binding. So what we've seen here is that the hemoglobin is like an efficient sponge. It soaks up all the oxygen which is available in the blood till it reaches almost 100%. So the more dissolved molecules there are, the greater the PaO2 value, and more will be available to bind to oxygen. Now, having calculated the amount of oxygen combined in the blood, let us get to know about more accurate indices to measure the amount of oxygen, which is the total oxygen content. Now, what is total oxygen content? It is denoted as CaO2, that is the content of oxygen. In the arterial blood, it is CaO2. In the venous blood, it is CvO2. So what does it reflect? It reflects the total number of oxygen molecules in the blood, both in the bound and the unbound form of the hemoglobin. So because it involves both the bound and the unbound form, you can see it in the equation that there is consideration for both SaO2 and PaO2. So the normal value comes to around 200 ml of oxygen in a liter of blood, or 20 in a deciliter of blood. So what is the clinical implications of this? So the partial pressure of oxygen, which is measured in the arterial blood, actually does not give us an actual picture of gas exchange. At the same time, this PaO2 is determined by an alveolar oxygen or alveolar capillary architecture only, and it is not affected by hemoglobin. So there is a possibility that the PaO2, although it does not indicate oxygen content, a patient can be having a normal PaO2 but still be starved for oxygen, because we do not know how much of oxygen is combined in hemoglobin in that particular context. And second, we should not depend on saturations like SpO2, because that's pulse oximetry. It is used to measure systemic arterial blood oxygen concentration or saturation, and this is based only on a color difference between oxygenated and reduced hemoglobin. So the more accurate method to calculate total oxygen is to know at the total oxygen content, CaO2, to know the total amount of oxygen in the blood. Now, having familiarized with the measurement of oxygen level in the blood, let us move on to oxygen delivery, which is easily understood in this oxygen dissociation curve, which we have learned during our physiology days. Now, this is an oxygen dissociation curve. This is a sigmoid saturation curve, which reflects a relationship between the PaO2 and SaO2, as we have discussed in 2 slides behind. This curve is sigmoid due to the fact that each oxygen that binds to hemoglobin, it increases the attraction of hemoglobin more and more oxygen, which means the affinity of oxygen really increases up till it reaches a full saturation. The degree of hemoglobin saturation is determined by the partial pressure of oxygen. This varies among different organs of the body, which means the lungs will have a different PA pressure when compared to the tissues. In the lung, the partial pressure of oxygen is approximately 100 millimeters of mercury. At the partial pressure of hemoglobin, the partial pressure of hemoglobin is high affinity for oxygen, that is around 98% saturated. But what happens in the tissue is that, typical partial pressure is only around 40. Here the hemoglobin has a lower affinity for oxygen, so which means it does not release all the oxygen into the tissue. When the hemoglobin leaves the tissue, it is still 75% saturated. If we look closely in the graph, what we can see is that if the PO2 is increased beyond 60, there is absolutely no difference in the hemoglobin saturation, which means that although the PO2 increases, the hemoglobin still has a high affinity for oxygen and it remains fully saturated. So which means that just by increasing oxygen more does not lead to an improved gas exchange, but it just causes hyperoxia. And the oxygen uptake or delivery is reflected by the shape of the factors affecting the oxygen dissociation curve. And it is not constant, it can be shifted. Either it can be shifted to the left or it can be shifted to the right, and again depends on the affinity and also the physiological conditions. So let's look at 2 scenarios there. One in the tissue, in the periphery, where the cellular metabolism is happening, the temperature, the carbon dioxide, DPG is increased and the pH is decreased. So here what happens is the oxygen is released where the tissue metabolism is increased. As the PO2 decreases, following that, the hemoglobin releases much more oxygen into the tissues. This allows the body to closely match the oxygen unloading the hemoglobin to oxygen utilization by the tissues. So whereas when the oxygen dissociation curve is shifted to the left, the earlier one was shifted to the right, whereas when the dissociation curve shifted to the left, the affinity of oxygen is increased, and this leads to blood loading and increasing the binding with more and more oxygen. And this decrease in temperature, carbon dioxide to the dpg, and there is increase in pH, which causes the shift to the left. So having discussed a few concepts about oxygen dissociation curve and hemoglobin affinity to oxygen and what determines to shift the curve to the right or to the left, let us go on to answer the most important question: what is the best way to increase oxygenation? So to increase oxygenation is by two methods: either increase the FiO2 or to increase the mean airway pressure. Increasing the mean airway pressure is the best method to increase the oxygenation. So if you look at this graph, we have airway pressure at one side and the time at the other axis. So this is a pressure time curve. So various aspects involved in this is the PIP, which is peak inspiratory pressure, PEP, which is the peak expiratory pressure, inspiration time and expiration time, and the amount of flow. So if you look at the formula to calculate the mean airway pressure, also known as PAW, there is the I time into the peak inspiratory pressure plus expiratory time into PWP by the total time taken. Now the problem with increasing mean airway pressure much more than the normal pressure is that it might cause alveolar over-distension and with the right-left shunt, and can also cause barotrauma. Now let's look at the ways to improve the mean air pressure. One, you can increase the flow rate. Normally the flow rate is kept by around 6 to 8. Generally 6 to 10 is usually sufficient. However, increasing in flow rate has got its own advantages and disadvantages. If the flow rates are it's kept high, it may help to open up the atelectatic alveoli, and also it improves the gas exchange. But the disadvantage of that is that if the flow rate is very high, it increases the mean airway pressure. At the same time, it decreases or impedes with the venous return. So higher MAP can be potentiated with increasing the flow rate. The second one is PIP, but increasing in PIP has more chances of barotrauma because the pressures may be more than what is required. Then the other option is to increase the I time, taking the total time for both inspiration and expiration as constant. If the inspiration time is increased, the expiration time is reduced at the same time because that is compensated. Now, increasing the inspiration time can increase the oxygenation. It can increase the MEP, but again, there are problems where because there is decrease in expiration time, the carbon dioxide release is also affected there. The most best method to increase the mean airway pressure is to increase the PWP or the PEEP. Once the PEEP is increased, the area under the curve majority increases the mean airway pressure. But PEEP should be increased only up to the optimal level. But there are problems with increasing PEEP where it impedes with the venous return and cardiac output. It compresses the pulmonary vasculature. And the other way to increase the MAP is to increase the frequency of it. But all these interventions are minimalistic to improve the MAP when compared to increasing the PEEP. So increasing PEEP is an ideal way to increase mean airway pressure. Also, if you notice in the graph that it's a sinusoidal pattern. Now, increasing the flow can actually change the sinusoidal pattern into a square wave. So this can be reflected in your pulmonary graphics in your ventilator in the unit. In our unit, when you're using a conventional mode ventilation, there is no button to increase the MAP or mean airway pressure, just like what you see in high frequency ventilation where there is a direct way to increase the MAP. However, in conventional ventilation, we need to use certain other knobs like to increase the PIP, to increase the PWP, or to increase the flow rate. Now, how do we assess the adequacy of ventilation both clinically and laboratorically? But clinically, the baby should have a normal perfusion. They should have a good chest expansion with a normal air entry, should not have increased retraction, and should be ideally maintaining saturation between 89 to 94%. And lab-wise, the blood gas analysis should have a CO2 between 35 to 50 and a PaO2 around 50 to 80. So the take-home message for today is that assessment of alveolar ventilation is a key to determine whether a patient is getting adequate oxygen. Assessment of oxygen content is a key to know how much of oxygen is present in the blood. And adequacy of ventilation, circulatory status, and hemoglobin all are essential for optimal oxygenation.